Hey, what's going on, crew? What's going on, my babies? If you haven't looked at part 1 of this video series, I highly encourage you to do so. It's a video where I'm talking about sticking points, and I'm basically dissecting a research paper that goes through possible causes of the sticking point and combine it with my experience throughout the year's training. And then I discussed some strategies in the general sense about some things that you could do to cure your sticking points in your lifts. However, I do not go into detail on how that looks like for each individual lift. So I thought I might go into a little bit more detail and dive a little bit deeper into what that strategy would look like for each individual lift in the squat, in the bench, and in the deadlift. So for the squat, we're gonna look at 2 possible sticking points. One that's above, at the bottom of the squat, and one that's midway through the lift. For both of those scenarios, we're gonna look at possible weak muscles to address, technique alterations that we can do in order to fix that, and assistance exercises that might improve your positions in that point where you're missing the lift. All right, the first thing we're gonna look at is the sticking point at the bottom of the squat. Now, we're gonna look at 3 different things. First thing is which muscles are possibly contributing to you missing at the bottom of the squat. And what are the muscles that you are gonna need to strengthen a little bit more? The 2 muscles are the adductors and the hamstrings. And while that might be a little bit against your common sense and something that you might not think would play a big role, it actually does. So the adductors is a big group of muscles that has multiple functions. One of the functions of the adductor muscles is one to stabilize the pelvis, but they're also a very powerful hip extensor when the hip drops below 90 degrees of hip flexion. So that's the reason why it's of interest to us and to someone that has a sticking point at the bottom of the squat. The second muscle group we're gonna talk about is the hamstring muscle. The hamstring muscle is a biarticulate muscle, which means that it crosses 2 joints. It comes from all the way from the hip, crosses below the knee behind you. So it has the semitendinosus and semimembranosus behind the knee. It attaches back here. It flexes the knee, but it also extends the hip. So that's why it interests us. Now let's cover 2 exercises to strengthen the hamstrings that might benefit you. The first one that we're gonna do is an eccentric hamstring RDL with a pause at the bottom. The first thing that you wanna do is you wanna keep the dumbbells at the level of the toe box, so far from your body. It's kind of like the opposite that you would do in a regular deadlift. You want to keep the weight far away from you so you can get a deeper stretch in the hamstrings. You want to slow down the descent, so count to 3 when you're coming down, and then count to 3 when you're at the bottom. The second exercise we're going to look at is a GHD. Now the setup for this one is important because it's one that I see a lot of people making mistakes in. The most common mistake people make when they're trying to do a glute ham raise is that they keep their pelvis flexed, and they do them like this, and they anteriorly tilt their pelvis. You don't want to do that because that essentially places most of the tension on your hip flexors, and you end up completing each rep with your hip flexors instead of with the hamstrings, which is what we intend to do. As far as placement of your knees go on the pad, you may start with your knees further back on the pad and slowly work your way to putting your knees higher up. This is easier because essentially you have more surface area in contact with the pad, which provides increased assistance. And when you put your knees further up on the pad, that increases the challenge or the difficulty of the movement. I actually just thought about this idea too. I told you guys that you can do it assisted with a partner, but some of you might train alone and not have a partner. So what you can do is, if you have a PVC pipe, if you don't have it, buy it because it's really cheap. And what you can do is just use this as assistance. So essentially you're gonna work your way down using the PVC pipe, and then you can work your way up on the PVC pipe as well. Now let's look at a couple exercises that target the adductor muscle group specifically. The first exercise we're gonna do is the Copenhagen adductor plank, an exercise that's gained a lot of popularity in sports in general that we can also use that will translate into our squat and deadlift. Not only is this particular exercise really great at increasing adductor stability and strength, but it's also great as far as injury prevention comes. There's a lot of research behind it that performing more of this exercise prevents the recurrence of groin-related injuries. The first way that you can do this exercise is a modified version. This version is not only easier, but it's also a good variation for people that get medial knee pain. Essentially, you're just holding that there for 30-45 seconds, repeating that 3 or 4 times. I usually prescribe this as an accumulated amount of time that you have to perform it. So usually I prescribe 3 minutes of accumulated time. Now, once you graduate from that, and if you want to increase the challenge of the exercise, you can move further away from the bench. Even further, yeah. So you can hold it there, or you can even move further away. And that one is like this one is the most difficult one. And then you can also flutter the bottom leg to go down and up. Yep. So you also get the other adductor on the other side. How's that? Tough. Yeah. All right, second exercise, really simple. We're gonna do a hip thrust with an adductor med ball squeeze. You can put really anything in between your thighs that encourages you to bring your thighs together and squeeze. So you just want to keep that tension all throughout the entire range of motion of the hip thrust and go from the bottom, squeeze all the way up, and hold it there for a couple seconds and back down. I love this exercise because it really caters to what the function of the adductor muscle group is, which is adduction or bringing the thighs in, as well as hip extension at or below 90 degrees. So this is one of my favorite exercises to target the adductors. I think is one that will greatly benefit a lot of people. Now that we're done talking about specific muscles that might be increasing the likelihood of you having that sticking point right there at the bottom of the back squat, we can move on to other things. The next thing I want to talk about is motor control, because this applies to really any movement that you do. Motor control is basically your ability to produce coordinated and synchronized muscle contractions, and we can see faults in motor control in the squat being a limiting factor as well. An example I can think about is a vertical jump. We know that those athletes that can jump the highest are the ones that can switch from eccentric to concentric the fastest, so that spend the least amount of time at the bottom. We can argue that the same thing happens in a squat. When people are not good at switching gears from the eccentric phase to the concentric phase, likely they can get stuck at the bottom of a squat because they don't have that ability to coordinate and to synchronize the switch between slowing down the barbell and then pushing the barbell up. So that's one thing that you also need to think about. We already went through specific exercises to target those muscles that might need a little bit extra work. Now, a drill that you can do in order to improve that motor control coordination and that switching gears between the eccentric phase and the concentric phase is a tempo squat, and that basically just involves decreasing the speed of when you're going from top to bottom to the squat, because that allows you to be a little bit more mindful and connected with the movement instead of just a really fast drop that might lead to you losing tension at the bottom of the squat and getting pinned or missing the squat at the bottom. So just slowing down to the descent of the squat, again, might allow you to create a stronger mind-muscle connection and allow you to be more coordinated and stay tighter at the bottom of the squat so you can come out of it easier. We've already gone through which muscles we need to target, as well as what are some technique alterations and specific drills that we need to do if your sticking point is at the bottom of the squat. Let's cover which muscle groups you would need to focus on more and which drills you could incorporate if your sticking point is at 90 degrees or slightly above, or midway through a squat, essentially. Now, the two muscle groups that I want to focus on, if this scenario applies to you, are the quads and the glutes. Now, your quads extend your knees and your glutes extend your hips, so it could be a case for either of those muscles. So let's cover a couple of movements for the quads and a couple of movements for the hamstrings. Take these just simply as suggested exercises, because I really don't believe there's a best exercise to target the quads, because essentially any lower body exercise that you can think of can become a quad exercise. You simply think about the further away from your body your knees are from your center of mass, the more it's a quad dominant exercise. Same thing goes for the hips. The further away the hips are from your center of gravity, the more hip dominant an exercise is. The first exercise we're gonna look at is the heel elevated goblet squat. And the reason why we do that is because usually the limiting factor for allowing the knees to come further in front of you is gonna be ankle flexibility. So by elevating your heels, you're getting rid of that limiting factor, which allows you to move your knees further in front. And finally, we're gonna look at an exercise to develop more your glutes. Now this exercise requires a lot of mindfulness and there's a lot of technique involved in order to perform it correctly. So just make sure that you're taking the necessary steps to learn the technique of this movement, and don't put too much weight on the bar if you're not ready for it. Now, this exercise is called a good morning. Basically what you're gonna do, you're gonna put the barbell on your back in the same position that you would do a squat in. Bend the knees just a little bit, so don't have your knees fully locked out. And then I just bend at the hip and go as low as I feel comfortable. Next, let's look at technically what are some of the faults that might be contributing to this as well. Two things jump into my mind when I think about someone missing a squat halfway through. The first one is not being able to generate enough acceleration or speed coming off the bottom of the squat. And the second one is inadequate tension being produced in the lowering phase. Now let's talk about that one first. Usually you see this in people that have a really, really fast descent and then they get dumped at the bottom because they get put out of position. I think about this as someone who's an archer. You don't usually think about trying to aim for a target with a really sloppy cocking process of the arrow. Rather, you want to be in control, set, and then go. The squat is no different than that. You want to make sure that during the descent, every single muscle in your hips is performing the action that it's supposed to, so it can generate the most amount of stability and put you in the right position, so that when you're at the bottom of the squat, you can push off and remain in the appropriate position. Now, there's a neurological concept that's called successive induction, and that's basically activating the antagonist muscles to a joint in order to produce a secondary, stronger muscle contraction. Now in the hips, you don't think about the hip flexors as a primary muscle in a squat because they really aren't. They are antagonist muscles. They're opposing to the muscles that are going to be acting upon the hip joint during the ascent of the squat. But the hip flexors and the adductors provide a huge amount of stability during the squat. Now the way I like to think about it is thinking about when you're lowering, contracting your hip flexors and trying to externally rotate your feet a little bit onto the ground so you can call upon or summon those small stabilizing muscles on your hip, so that when you're at the bottom of the squat, you're really tight and in position so you can push off. Another drill that I like to do, if you're a trainer, this is a great exercise that you can teach your clients. You're gonna push my hands up to your face, or push your legs onto your face. Yep, hold it there and then lower, let me win. Yeah, so you feel your hip flexors working a lot more, right? Do it again. That's essentially the concept that I try to teach people about successive induction and about maintaining tension throughout the entire lift. It's a hard thing to conceptualize because in the lowering phase, you don't think about the hip flexors as a muscle that's contributing to anything in the squat. But once you understand, once you start mapping out that connection between the hips just being engaged throughout the movement so you can generate more tension, then it starts making a lot more sense. But this is a really good cue that you can use in order to make it more tangible for people to digest what essentially I'm trying to say. All right, and the second thing was people not generating enough acceleration from the bottom to the top. And for that, you can just incorporate more work using bands. So basically the bands or accommodating resistance, you could be either bands or chains. Basically what that does is it increases the difficulty of the lift as you're coming up. And so it just helps you generate more speed and helps you recruit more muscle fibers as you're coming up from the squat. I think this video ended up being way longer than I anticipated. I wanted to try to make it short and sweet so it's easier to digest, but it might be a little bit longer than we expected. But anyway, I just wanted to put out some closing thoughts also and add a point that I think it's really important for people to understand. There's a quote by Sebastian Oreb, Australian strength coach, that he said, work on your weaknesses, but don't neglect your strengths. And that made so much sense to me, because obviously it is important for you to identify and target your weaknesses and work on them. But a mistake that a lot of people make is that they swing the pendulum too far into the other direction and start working too much on their weaknesses and don't keep working on whatever is working for you. So just remember, all of these suggestions are essentially accessories, are things that you need to add into your program. But don't try to change too many variables at the same time, because it doesn't provide for a systematized way to essentially solve what the issue is. You don't want to change too many things at the same time, and you don't want to change your plan completely, especially if what you're doing currently is working, whatever technique you're using is working for you. That's it for today's video about sticking points in the squat. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and all that shit. And make sure to come back next week for part 3 of this sticking point series, where we'll be talking about the bench sticking points and how to improve them. So catch you guys next time.